Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. And it's the Game Plan with Dave Shore. And the Game Plan highlights some great stories with people that I've had the chance to work with over the years. And today's guest, Tyler Cox, is one of those, back from the Dallas-Fort Worth media market back in the 2000s for me. But Tyler, you spent a lot of time in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. How many years?
Oh my gosh, let's see. I went to work for WBAP in 92 and I retired in 2016. So all those years. So what is that? Gosh, more 32 years, I guess. 30 some years.
You're asking two broadcasters to pull off math in our head, right?
That's how I got in radio, not in math.
Well, one of the reasons why I got in the media was, even when I started as a news reporter on television, Tyler, was the ability to find out the latest about stories. And stories always fascinate me. And the one of the Amber Alert system, everybody knows it. It's used in all 50 states. And as of the end of last year, the government site says that over 1,250 children were successfully recovered through the use of that system. But we wanted to explore in this episode how the story all began in the Dallas-Fort Worth market. Sure. And you were one of the members of a group of broadcasters who decided to get this going. What led to that decision?
Well, again, you hit on a very important word there, group. This was certainly a collaborative effort. You know, it brought together broadcasters who were in competition with one another, who saw a need and a common goal that could be met through our medium. And so competitive natures were set aside and we got started. I have to confess, you know, the first time I heard about the Amber Plan, and it was mentioned that, you know, the police would send information and use our airwaves to send information. The journalist in me was a bit concerned momentarily because I thought, are we turning over control of the airways to law enforcement? That is not the case, was not the case. So it all began. Amber Hagerman, of course, was the famous sad story, who was abducted and her body was found sometime later in 96. And a listener to one of the radio stations in Dallas, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name. No, it'll come to me. Diana Simone. Diana Simone.
Wow, good memory.
Wrote a letter to the manager of her favorite radio station, which at that time was Mix 1029, and said, you know, when she had been in Europe, she had seen how communities came together to find abducted and missing children. Couldn't the radio industry do something like that? And so at the next meeting of the Dallas Association of Radio Managers, this topic was brought up, and the discussion began as to how do we make this happen? Initial contact was made with Dallas Police, with Fort Worth Police, Arlington Police, and there was some great interest in seeing this develop. And so over the course of several months, the plan was put together. The way it worked in the early days, this is, you know, the pre-digital era, 96, of course, that
sure.
The two primary news-oriented radio stations in DFW, WBAP, where I worked, and KRLD, our crosstown competitor, would serve as the focus point of getting the word out about the Amber Plan. And so police agencies would send a fax to our two radio stations. We would confirm with one another, we have it, you have it. And we had previously then divided up the list of all the radio stations in DFW. WBAP would start sending this fax out to the first half. KRLD would start sending the fax out to the second half. When we completed our halves, we'd repeat and switch just to make sure it got to everybody. But it took, you know, a good 30 to 45 minutes for this information to get out to all the broadcasters. And, you know, one of the things we realized early on is that every minute that goes by, an abductor is another mile down the road with the child that they've abducted. So we started figuring out how can we make this faster. About that time, the emergency alert system came into play. The old system was called the EBS, the Emergency Broadcast System, and it was just a simple tone that was transmitted and radio stations could receive and retransmit that audio. With the emergency alert system, we were able to use a category under the civil emergency so that WBAP, as one of the primary EAS stations, could send that out as an EAS, and it was instantly in the hands of every radio and TV station in DFW, cutting the time from 30 to 40 minutes to under 2. That was a huge step. The FCC eventually created a special category for the Amber Alert system, And the rest, as they say, is history. We wondered, would this have an impact? Of course, we've heard the stories of how it did. There was one particular case where I recall a gentleman called Arlington police and said that truck they're describing on the Amber Alert system, it's right in front of me.
Wow.
And Arlington police were able to intercept it, rescue the child, and she was safely returned to her family. I wondered how this would start to grow. We started hearing from broadcasters in other states, sometimes other police agencies. Arkansas was one of the first ones to contact us. And we knew that it was starting to have an impact on the American psyche when I'm watching an episode of Law and Order one night. And on Law and Order, they're going to activate the Amber Plan. And we thought,
Wow.
it's here. It's a real thing in the minds of most Americans.
It's amazing the steps, especially when you're talking about the years. We're not talking about 2025 now, when there's a lot of technology and everything, but the step from here to here had to be helped by some others as well. And if I remember right, President Bush was in office then, right?
That's
and
right.
So obviously being a Texan himself, did that help in terms of getting it to the national stage?
Well, yes. In fact, some of us had the great privilege of being able to go to the White House to witness the president signing the legislation. And what that did, it didn't create a national Amber Plan, but what it was, it broke down barriers so that cooperation could take place. There were already systems in place that if a car was stolen in Texas, Oklahoma State Police would know right away. That was
Right.
not the case on a missing child. And this paved the way for an Amber Alert system, information to be disseminated across the country.
At what point, Tyler, we're talking about a group, and if I saw the list, there was about 7 names that I saw on the list.
Okay.
A lot of times you'll attend meetings and ideas, and you never know what it's going to mean down the road. Did you or anyone else just kind of get the feeling like this was something that could be of major impact if all went well?
Yeah, that started hitting us early on, particularly when we started hearing from other communities who were interested in trying to, well, can we do that here? The thing that is one of the beautiful things about the Amber Alert system, it doesn't cost anybody a penny. We're using the public airways, we're using the technology that is there to pass the information along and getting it out. I need to correct that. In the early stages, using the fax machine, all of the radio stations agreed to set up a dedicated fax machine just for that purpose. And so there was a bit of expense involved there. But once we were able to transition to the emergency alert system, all expenses, all excuses of not being able to afford it went away.
Sometimes in success stories, there was moments that also helped just elevate it to the next level. Is there anything that we're missing in terms of what really took it from here to here?
It's a great question. I think in terms of what helped take it from here to here was national media started seeing what was happening in Texas. And they started seeing that these were children who were getting back home to their families, back home safely. The real regret, of course, is that it came along after Amber's tragic case. In fact, the letter that Deanna Simone wrote to the radio station manager at Mix 102, she concluded that letter, I remember this now, she said, if you're able to do this, I suggest you call it the Amber system. So this listener came up with the idea, and she was profiled in a book called The Power of One. It never became a really big bestseller, but it certainly profiled different individuals across the country who had done things as an individual that made a difference. And there was a whole chapter devoted to how The Power of One, Deanna Simone, came up with this.
That is amazing. When I asked you if there was anything that took it from here to here, I also thought of myself driving down the road and seeing the electronic signs, the digital signs that so many states have added. To me, that gives it another dimension because you could see it that there was an Amber Alert underway. And so you went probably from an audio form to much more visual as well by a lot of these highway systems.
Well, the sweet irony of that situation is we had a committee called the Amber Alert Task Force. We were having a meeting of the various radio stations and who were involved in operating and maintaining the Amber Alert system. And we had a conversation with the Texas Department of Transportation about the possibility of utilizing those message boards. While we were in that meeting, an Amber Alert was issued. We got on the phone in that meeting, contacted the Texas Department of Transportation, and that was the first time those signs went up.
Wow.
It's, the timing on so many things that took place in the early stages of this was providential.
Yeah, it really was. And it has meant so much indeed. And I think the thing that we could really stress here, Tyler, and this is really behind the scenes, because from all my years in broadcasting, there wasn't often a situation where you got together. You were competitors with other radio stations
That's
or
right.
television stations. You often didn't get together to work on one project. Did this make it very unique as well?
Oh, absolutely. There was already an association of radio managers, and they met once every couple of months, and all the station managers, and they were talking about advertising needs with ad agencies, global issues that all broadcasters could share. But it was that group then that started bringing up the idea of the Amber Plan, which led to eventually to the Amber Task Force, which helped manage and run the system. WBAP and KRLD have historically been very strong, honorable competitors with one another, both strong news presence and the late great Michael Spears, who was the program director at KRLD at the time, and I was with WBAP, and we were able to realize if we work together on this, we can do some good. And those competitive differences were set aside for this.
While we're talking about this form of media, the medium that was used in radio, Tyler, how much has it changed? People will say that you can get your news and you can get your information in so many different ways. Has radio over time reinvented itself in any way, and what is the impact that it can still have?
Well, certainly I think I personally believe, there's always going to be a place for local radio stations who are plugged into their communities. Those are the ones that I think show the most success. One of the interesting outgrowths, though, of the Amber Plan is, and you touched on this earlier, it's spread now beyond radio. First thing was that television got involved. Second thing was the message boards on the highway. And then as digital technology started developing with mobile phones and that sort of thing, Amber Alerts now are sent out over cellular mobile networks. They're sent over all kinds of internet platforms. So it has spread far beyond just the 30-some radio stations who were involved in day one.
Yeah, and it's amazing because I also think it's very unique, and I felt like it was unique working in that market. That is a market where it's a great research type of market because you had such a large penetration and such a large area that you covered as well. And that probably helped in its maturation as well, just because you were testing it in a very large area.
Well, and you had two major cities working together. You got Dallas and Fort Worth sitting side by side. It is the metropolitan statistical area market of DFW. Fort Worth likes to look down its nose at Dallas, and Dallas likes to look at Fort Worth as being a cow town. But the fact that we were able to bring together both radio stations based in Dallas and Fort Worth, law enforcement agencies in Dallas, Fort Worth, Arlington. In fact, the Arlington PD was probably the strongest driving force behind it. The Amber Hagerman abduction occurred under their watch, and they had a personal vested interest in seeing this succeed. D. Anderson, who was the sheriff's department, the Arlington Police Department public information officer, was heavily involved. He eventually became the elected sheriff of Tarrant County, and he was much a factor as well. I had the great honor of being at a national meeting a few years into it that was sponsored by, after the legislation signed by President Bush, there was a coordinated effort going on to how do we get that information disseminated. And I was there, and they presented me a plaque. I was no more deserving a plaque than anybody else. And my comment was, and I think I caught them by surprise, I said, well, guys, this plaque's not big enough because you need to have about 25 more names on here. Sorry about the phone ringing.
Oh, no, that's okay.
That's my, somebody's at my front door. I'll make that go away. Sorry. But all of us were, from day one, turn that off, intent on making it not about any one individual, but how the group came together to make this happen.
Yeah. And I think that you all really, beginnings have to start somewhere. And that's why I thought this is fascinating, because this has now become something that many, many people understand what it is. And I appreciate you sharing the story. Is there anything, knowing now what you do now, is there anything that you would have said could have been done different? Or is it just one of those things that it just all kind of laid out perfectly?
It just evolved in its own timetable. Uh, digital transmission of the information wasn't available in 96. It was actually in 97 when we had our first actual, I think, alert. But the technology had not caught up to the need yet. So we were doing what we could with what we had. But as soon as the EAS, Emergency Alert System, was being thought about, we all as a group said, that's where we need to be. And that's where we got to. And again, from there, it's just spread exponentially.
We started this and I featured the fact that here's the story behind the Amber Alert system. But in talking to Tyler even more, Tyler, you've been a part of such a media platform, and you've mentioned WBAP, which was a station that I was affiliated with as well, being in the same building as you and actually filling in on the air there.
That's right.
I remember as a long-standing radio station, you all had so much audio that you had almost found later on that came from the Kennedy assassination, right? Which was another huge event that everyone knows in Dallas. But you all had so much just raw audio from just being on the air that day and several days after.
Well, if I could take a second to tell you how we found that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to.
NBC5 television in Dallas-Fort Worth used to be WBAP television. WBAP radio, WBAP television, and the Fort Worth Star-Telegram were all under the Amon Carter family. Separated years later, WBAP TV became KXAS TV, and they were approaching one of their milestone anniversaries. I think it was the 50th anniversary. And one of their reporters was down in the basement at the Channel 5 studios and saw these boxes over in a corner, pulled them out and turned them around. And it was something like 28 continuous hours of WBAP radio coverage of the Kennedy assassination.
Good.
The coverage actually began early that morning on the 3rd, covering the president's speech at the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth, right on through into the assassination. And we just continued, I wasn't there, but someone had the foresight to roll tape, and all those hours were preserved. And one of my desires was always, before I retired, and here's a goal that we were able to accomplish, we got those reels of tape donated to the 6th floor museum in Dallas, where they are preserved. Because for years after we found them, they sat in those 2 original cardboard boxes under my desk. Vacuum cleaners could have been running right by them, and because of the magnetic impulse could have erased some of that audio. But again, someone was very smart. Those 10-inch reels of tape individually were placed inside a film canister. So they were encased in metal. They were all there. And I got a call then from the Channel 5 reporter, says, we found something you might like to hear. He said,
kind of.
We want to bring it to you, but we want to bring a crew. So they came out, and we went into one of the production studios and strung up that tape and started playing it. Dave, the audio quality was like it was live today. It was stunning. One of the things that we did, one of the many things we did, first of all that audio is available on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and type BAP and JFK, anybody can take a listen to that. We decided on the 50th anniversary of the assassination to string all of those reels together, and we did a separate audio stream. Now, there were occasions where there was a gap in the coverage, and so we would fill with music and announcements that more is coming. But on the day of the assassination on WBAP AM, we were covering the day's events. On WBAP's special stream, in real time, was playing back the audio of the assassination day. Now, I had a modem on my laptop, so we didn't have streaming audio in cars back then.
Well, of course we didn't.
And I drove an hour to work every day. So I put my laptop and plugged in my streaming modem and started listening to the stream in my car as I was listening to WBAP AM in my car. And it was eerie because there were times when the same thing was happening on both. The weather forecast was going on. The newscasts were going on. The newscasts on BAP today were reflecting back on what happened 50 years ago. And BAP Stream was reflecting on what was happening at that moment. It was a very surreal time. We found out that we had listeners globally to that stream that day.
No, that's amazing. And you know what? It's more than just two lifelong broadcasters here that find that fascinating. I know some people who find this show in a search function or on Google will find that fascinating as well. Two more subjects in this episode, Tyler,
Sure.
if I can. And one is radio, and especially news talk. And then when I got involved in sports talk, and that became a necessity, is for the large markets to have big personalities.
Right.
These were people, the hosts that were larger in life.
Right.
You had quite a few during your careers at various radio stations as well. Take me, though, what our landscape is like now in 2025 with the political fighting and the draw a line in the sand that everyone feels, as compared to when you were programming and talking to hosts about how they might want to approach a subject in maybe like 1990 or the 2000s.
Well, first of all, in 92 is when I went to work for WBAP. And at that time, it was a country music station. I was hired to convert it to news talk. I'd had background in that. I was in Boston before and Sacramento, where a fellow named Limbaugh was on our local staff at KFBK. So the radio station management, John Hare was the president and general manager at the time. He became president of ABC.
Of course.
He worked out the deal to get Limbaugh for WBAP radio. They connected me with John, and so we made the transition into that. So the radio station was really with personalities larger than life. Now, certainly Rush was that. But you know, there's a guy still on the air today in the morning show on WBAP named Hal J. Hal has been there 36, 37 years, something like that. I'll never forget my first day at the radio station. Hal pulls me aside and says, I got a question for you. I said, what's that? He says, will you promise to not take us news talk? I said, well, Hal, if you look at my background, there's not a lick of country music radio in my background. Now, why do you think they brought me here? And I said, you got to understand, people listen to you in the morning show because of you. You were playing 4 country songs an hour, and the rest of it was just Hal and Dick Siegel and Sam from Sales and a variety of characters. It was personality driven. And so to make our point, we started very slowly pulling out the music of the morning show. This month, we didn't play any music between 30 and 45 of the hour. Next month, nothing between 15 and 30. Long story short, it took 4 months to take the country music off the radio station. A few weeks later, I get a call from a woman wanting Hal to play a tune by the Dixie Chicks, the original Dixie Chicks, for her sister's birthday. I said, well, ma'am, we don't play music. She said, Hal plays country music. I said, he hasn't played a song in 6 weeks. And she says to me, I thought he was taking an awful long time between the records. And at that point, Hal became convinced, okay, this will work. But Hal was part of that. You know, somebody you know as well as I do, Randy Galloway did Sports at 6. It was a sports talk show at 6 p.m. every night on WBAP. Randy was a newspaper columnist who had a gift, and he was the only guy, because of his drawl, the only guy on the staff I allowed to say, yeah, BAP instead of BAP. Because I wasn't going to change that in Randy. That wasn't going to happen.
No, he was never going to change.
Never happened.
It is, and I love talking about that, because the big personalities. And one of the things that I said when I would try to help the younger ones later on is that you mentioned a guy like Rush Limbaugh, the late Rush Limbaugh,
Right.
And there's several other personalities. When we say polarizing, that meant, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler, but I always explained it that meant that half the audience listening loved him and the other half hated him.
And
right, and that's what made it very unique.
Oh, that's true.
That it wasn't just a fan club. It was a fan club of people that wanted to hear something that set them off.
But you know what else happened? Some of those folks who hated him tuned in so they would know what he was talking about, so they could argue about
Exactly.
it. It really crossed both sides of the aisle in terms of the early exposure to Rush. You know, and when Rush passed away, several of us, myself included, and I'm not the only one, we said he'll never be replaced. No one will have the impact on radio and on AM radio particularly that Rush Limbaugh did. You know, in 95, the National Association of Broadcasters was holding its annual convention in Dallas. Rush came to visit it. They had a meeting with all of the Rush Limbaugh affiliates, filled up a big conference room, big ballroom. And one by one, those managers said, Rush, you saved my radio station. because AM was already starting to fade. It was not a place for music. It's a place for information and conversation.
Yeah. The last thing I'll ask you about
Sure.
that though is that when you said when he passed, we might not have that again. Is that because that host couldn't achieve that level, or corporate America that owns many of the media platforms wouldn't allow that to happen?
That's a great question. And I think probably the both are involved in the truth. When Rush announced to us in Sacramento that he was going to be moving to New York to start this national talk show, we all were like, "Yeah, right. That'll work out well." And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. He created a form because before Rush, talk radio was Larry King at night, Sally
Yeah.
Jesse Raphael giving lovelorn advice, Bernard Meltzer and Bruce Williams giving financial advice. There was no national talk show dealing with issues of the day. He set the stage for all that followed him. And I do think there is probably more hesitation on the corporate side today for something like that. We weren't megalopolis corporations at that point, and stations were willing to, with local ownership, willing to take a chance.
Yeah. Well, I say as I was then younger than I am today. So when I first came to Dallas in 2000, I thank you for the mentorship and the
Oh,
advice you gave when I was part of an upstart station that went on the air for the first time when we started ESPN 103.3, right there in the
real
very same
sports
building
talk
down
for
the
real
hallway.
sports fans. If you recall, we called it that.
We sure did.
And that was just a great experience in terms of all of us coming together and building something from the scratch and ground
Yeah,
zero.
it's fun to be a part
Yeah,
of something that you can build up.
right.
And you were with this Amber Alert system. And I will tell folks as we say goodbye, I will tell folks that as soon as I called Tyler and asked if we could approach this subject, the first thing Tyler said is, as long as you understand it wasn't just me, it was part of a group. And so
Absolutely.
thank you for sharing that. You represented a very important group that all got together there in that room and created today what we hopeful will be less children abducted just because of how successful a program is. So, Tyler, thanks so much for your time.
Been a pleasure.
Best of luck for the rest of what you do.
Been great catching up with you, Dave.